Welcome back to CNN News Central. I want to get straight to Capitol Hill and Democratic Congressman Mike Quigley of Illinois, who joins us now. Congressman, thank you so much for being with us. I know you've been tracking the breaking news into CNN. The IDF acknowledging that 3 Israeli hostages were killed by IDF soldiers mistakenly identified as members of Hamas. Congressman, I'm wondering what your reaction to that news is.
Yeah, I'm reminded this week I met with one of the former hostages who traveled to Washington, D.C. to hear her account of the horrors of her captivity. And obviously, with any conflict, there is the tragedy of friendly fire deaths. We've already heard about the fog of war causing these in this conflict. And obviously, today is a great tragedy as well. And understanding, of course, that corrections have to be made, greater scrutiny and more protections put in place to prevent against such things. But ultimately, Hamas is responsible for having hostages in the first place.
Congressman, to that point of steps that have to be taken, the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, is in the region having discussions with Israeli officials, among others. And one of the messages we understand that he's taking to them, coming from the Biden White House, is that Israel needs to be much more selective when it comes to civilian life in Gaza. President Biden described some of the targeting of Hamas entities in Gaza as indiscriminate bombing by Israel. What would be your message to the IDF, to leaders in Israel, over the way that they're handling this war?
Well, first, I want to begin by saying I was in Gaza some time ago after a similar conflict, smaller in nature, but I could see firsthand just how difficult that task is. Having said that, I agree with Mr. Sullivan that needs to take place. First, it's the right thing to do. Humanitarian aid has to get in. There have to be humanitarian corridors, and they have to be much more protective of civilians in the area. It's the right thing to do, but it's also the smart thing to do. I fully appreciate their absolute right to try to dismantle and destroy Hamas. They never will completely. But while you're attempting to dismantle Hamas, you don't want to recruit future Hamas soldiers. It's not just a military force, it's a movement. So the manner in which they do this will impact a great deal the challenges they face in the coming years.
Congressman, I want to pivot now to Ukraine. We originally invited you on to talk about the stalled status of negotiations over sending aid to Eastern Europe. CNN has also learned that there are serious concerns among not just U.S. officials, but officials in Europe as well, that without significant aid, Ukraine could quickly fall to Russian forces. Given that your Republican colleagues have been calling for a more well-defined endgame in Ukraine, they want the White House to define victory. How would you define victory for Ukraine? Is it President Zelensky's call that Ukraine must retake Crimea?
Well, if someone invaded the United States and took several of our states, we wouldn't agree with some other countries saying, well, you should be satisfied with only losing some of your region. They have an absolute right to their territorial integrity. I think that's part of victory. I think guaranteed security provisions in the future, a rebuilt Ukraine is part of that victory, and holding those accountable for the horrors of war that I witnessed firsthand. I've been in Ukraine twice since the conflict, and I saw evidence of Putin's atrocities, including the mass graves at Bucha. So I think that's the ultimate victory. For someone to suggest that some other countries should sacrifice because we aren't willing to back up the fight for the reasons we fought the Second World War, why we fought and formed the United Nations and the EU and NATO, Ukraine is doing our dirty work. And finally, if any of them imagine that Putin would be satisfied with Ukraine, they wouldn't form a federation with puppet governments in Belarus, Ukraine, move on Moldova, Georgia, a land bridge to Kaliningrad and beyond. Look, Secretary Austin, General Milley said it best. If we don't halt Putin's aggression now, there'll be more money to be spent with double our defense budgets, and there would be much more bloodshed in the future.
And yet, Congressman, the Washington Post reported a few weeks ago that the White House has told Ukrainian leaders that they should signal to the Kremlin that they are open to peace talks, given that the counteroffensive has stalled, given that conversations about sending aid to Ukraine have met a logjam in Congress. Do you think it's time for Ukraine perhaps to revisit its ambitions?
Absolutely not, because I wouldn't expect our country to do that. And I also understand how our national security is involved in that. And the horrible message we would be sending to other adversaries with eyes on Taiwan, for just one example. We would be telling autocrats across the world that it's fair game, that will defend democracy on a limited basis and a limited time. If you're patient, you can do whatever you want.
So then is it a mistake for the White House to tell Ukrainian leaders to signal to the Kremlin that they're open toward peace talks with Vladimir Putin right now?
I haven't been told by the White House that they did that, but if they did, it would be a mistake, and I would strongly disagree. I would support Ukraine to that ultimate victory, just because it's in our interest and clearly in the interest of Eastern Europe and our allies there.
Congressman Mike Quigley, we have to leave the conversation there. Very much appreciate your time, and happy holidays, sir.
Thank you. You as well.
Of course.